I usually start, but that's okay. Thank you. Good afternoon, judges. We are Reno High School's Unit 2. I'm Nate McKay, and I'll be attending the University of Southern California.
My name is Paul Lessard, and I will be attending Texas A&M University.
My name is Kira Goris. I'll be attending the University of Hawaii at Manoa.
My name is Nicholas Howell. I'll be attending Valley Forge Military Academy. Our unit coach is Mr. Henry Ng, and our teacher is Mr. Richard Clark.
This is the national hearing finals for Unit 2, and we will be discussing Question 2. The general object was to provide a cure for the evils under which the United States labored. That in tracing these evils to their origin, every man had found in it, it's in the turbulence and follies of democracy. What impact, if any, did these evils have on the drafting of the Constitution and the type of government it established? What evidence of these evils was there in the colonies just before the American Revolution and in the newly independent states up to the time of the Philadelphia Convention? To what extent, if any, do the follies of democracy referred to by Edmund Randolph exist today? Explain your position.
In his book, Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville wrote, "The great advantage of the Americans is that they have arrived at a state of democracy without having to endure a democratic revolution. Though the United States had arrived at a state of democracy, the Constitution's framers understood from their knowledge of previous democracies and experiences under colonial America that democracy inherently contains several evils and follies, including majority tyranny, fear of authority, and direct elections. In attempting to address these follies of democracy, the framers referred to Republican principles to safeguard our country from untamed democracy."
Chief among the evils of democracy is what Federalist 10 calls majority tyranny. Philosophical fears of majority tyranny can be traced back to Aristotle, who favored a polity form of government because it mixed elements of democracy and an oligarchy. Writing, "When states are democratically governed, the people become a mob." In the 1690s, the Massachusetts colony saw the evils of mob rule during the Salem witch trials, when the purity majority accused, tried, and executed many of the colony's poor and marginalized individuals. Scholar Emerson Baker argues in his book Storm of Witchcraft that this mob rule led to a distrust of the government, serving as a colonial examples of the dangers of excessive democracy.
During salutary neglect, the colonists were accustomed to a direct democracy through local governments. Their fear and distrust of central authority was affirmed when Britain asserted their control over the colonies after the passage of the Sugar Act. Over the course of the American Revolution, the implementation of the Articles of Confederation reflected the framers' fears of central authority by leaving absolute sovereignty to state governments.
The Articles of Confederation lacked a central power to combat the follies of democracy originating from state governments. Shays' Rebellion demonstrated majority tyranny and fear of authority when disenfranchised farmers rebelled against their unrepresentative local and state tax collectors. At the Philadelphia Convention, Elbridge Gerry said that Shays' Rebellion stemmed from the excess of democracy. In response, the framers ceded more power to a centralized federal government with the necessary and proper clause in Article 1, Section 8, and the supremacy clause in Article 6, Section 2.
Direct elections were another concern discussed at the Philadelphia Convention. The framers placed little trust in their constituents, seeing direct elections as one of the follies of democracy. However, they understood that Republican government relied on the consent of the governed, with Alexander Hamilton acknowledging that a fundamental principle of our representative democracy is that the people choose whom they please to govern them.
Majority tyranny was combated in the 1943 case of West Virginia Board of Education v. Barnett, where the board was questioned on its requirement for students to salute the flag in schools. Justice Robert Jackson wrote in his majority opinion that majorities do ugly things, and the constitutional framers were correct that pure majority rule needs to be tempered by minority rights. Today, these issues of majority tyranny exist in individual states like Nevada, where the Bundy family claims that their individual property rights have been infringed through what Bundy calls the federal government's tyrannical usurpation of public lands.
Additionally, the framers safeguarded the national government from the follies of democracy through the indirect election of senators in Article 1 and the president in Article 2. Alexander Hamilton defended the Electoral College in Federalist 68, writing that it affords a moral certainty that the office of president will never fall lot to any man not endowed with the requisite qualifications.
The Electoral College has undertaken aspects of democracy specifically with candidates winning the popular vote but not the presidency. Societal discontent and constitutional challenges to the Electoral College question its utility, but instituting change in the way we elect the president would require drastic constitutional change and threaten the Republican safeguards balancing democracy in America. Thank you.
We now have a few questions for you. You mentioned some examples such as an indirect election, but I wonder what other parts or provisions in the Constitution and its Bill of Rights were included to deal with the framers' concerns with these evils of democracy? How did they account for that in these documents?
When we discussed the Salem witch trials, one of the things that came out of that was this a revived desire, also stemming from the Puritans that came over from America to escape religious persecution, a desire for religious freedom, which is seen in the Constitution in Article 6, Section 3, which prohibits any use of a religious test to require that any congressman have a religious test to be in office.
Because the framers had been ruled under these Articles of Confederation with such a lackluster Congress, they were very adamant about the role of Congress in our Constitution, specifically, as we mentioned before, senators being proportional and the House being, senators being equal and the House being proportional. They wanted to balance this because, as Oliver Ellsworth said, which many agreed with, he'd said that we are partly national, partly federal, and for this reason we need the balance to avoid this lackluster government that they'd experienced before writing the Constitution.
Alexander Hamilton writes in Federalist 78 that the role of the judiciary is to protect minorities. He figured that because Supreme Court justices are appointed and they are protected from the politics that is present in much of the other branches, that the Supreme Court could be itself separated from any sort of majority tyranny.
So, in regard to the Edmund Randolph's attitude toward the framers and Americans' attitude, the Edmund Randolph's attitude toward democracy, and Americans' attitude toward democracy, the way I get your presentation is I see that you're suggesting that they're skeptical about democracy in principle, but they have a kind of love-hate view of it in practice over time. Do I understand you correctly?
Yes, I would say that you do understand us correctly. We see throughout American history this democracy ideal coming more into play. It becomes more relevant to us. We see this with the 17th Amendment. We can now directly elect our senators instead of state legislatures sending them. Because of this, we saw many Federalists at the convention actually supported this. Federalists such as James Wilson, the writer of the preamble, actually stated that he thought it was more important that both be democratically elected.
But it's interesting that you would cite a case as late as in West Virginia versus Barnett, which I see seems to be a reflection of to stop in excess of democracy. And so that late in the story. So it seems like through American history, it's sort of up and down when it comes to democracy. Is that your interpretation?
Well, the love and hate relationship you described is up and down, and we can see it just with Edmund Randolph himself. Going into the convention, he believed that the Articles of Confederation had been largely a failure, and so that is why he came to the convention and largely had what today we would see as Federalist viewpoints. However, after the Constitution, he stayed the duration but did not actually sign because he felt that the Bill of Rights was necessary, that to have a truly Republican government, we had to enumerate these rights for the people. But then when he went to his ratifying convention, he actually voted to ratify the Constitution, because if it weren't ratified, then we would go back to this unhinged democracy that we saw during the Articles of Confederation.
Additionally, the framers included the Guarantee Clause in Article 4 of the Constitution that guarantees each state a Republican form of government to avoid this excess of democracy, so that every single government within the state government within the United States would not be able to even experience these excesses of democracy and would have to go through this Republican form.
Okay, so Nico, you mentioned Mr. Bundy, so I'm just going to go there. But I'm going to frame it this way. So we have a constitution that certainly centralized more power in the national government in response to the experience of the Articles of Confederation. Yet, Mr. Madison got his wish. We have an extended republic. Could you make an argument that, in fact, I won't ask you to make an argument that Mr. Bundy was right, but that really because of the breadth of that republic that we have today, that it isn't folly to say that there ought to be more localized forms of democracy to control, for example, land use in a state like Nevada.
I I completely agree with that statement. In the very first Anti-Federalist paper, it was written that there's local governments are meant to protect the common good of just the small individualized groups. And we believe that these smaller groups are more attuned to the desires of the people. That's why there's this proposition from New California, which splits the state up into 5 different states itself, because the needs of the northern kind of rural Californians are so much more different than that of the southern urban cities.
In addition, to tie it back to our founders, there was a large advocacy from the Anti-Federalists for state power, as we all know. And so in what is known as the Anti-Federalist paper number 63, written by Richard Henry Lee, he says that there's a need for us to not forget the power of states and to not forget that they were once sovereign in themselves, and that it was important for them to have their own interpretations of our Constitution, as well as the ones that are above them.
Good. Thank you very much. I have a little bit of feedback to share with you before we go on our merry way. I'd like to say that I very much enjoyed your opening statement. I really appreciated how you used the tyranny of the majority as sort of an organizing framework that you came back to multiple times. And towards the end, there was this mention of the Electoral College and someone winning the presidency without winning the popular vote. And I wondered if there could have been more discussion in that statement about maybe perhaps the tyranny of the minority in today's society.
So I'd like to present, I thought your opening discussion was very nicely developed, again, around the idea of a tyranny and majority. I thought your responses to the questions was great. I thought the point on Edmund Randolph really made the point about sort of vacillation toward the idea of democracy. I would have liked to have heard, I'm the historian, I would like to have heard a little bit more about the 1780s and experience that Americans had with state laws, and that sort of thing in that time period.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for kicking it off with Tocqueville. That always warms my heart. But you used it effectively, the way you talked about democracy. You had good participation in response to our questions. You had good clarity on what you meant by the evil of democracy. It's a vague term in a lot of ways, right? So you probably spent a lot of time trying to unpack what could that possibly mean. But you had really great focus on majoritarianism as a key for understanding it. I also like the fact that you embraced that final question. I agree, you said, Paul. And we're very interested in how students are thinking about how these ideas apply right where they are. And by the way, I spent a lot of time tromping around Lovelock, Nevada.
I'm sorry.
It's a long story why, but you had a good sense of what the issues were at stake there. So, good job.
Thank you.
Thank you.